15 years ago, I put 18 bullets into my husband, Quentin, and my oldest boy, Beau, and walked free after just 48 hours. Now I know what you're thinking. Does a woman shoot down her own family and not spend the rest of her days behind bars? Well, sugar, that's exactly what I'm fixing to tell you, because Lord knows I've carried this weight long enough. And maybe it's time someone else understood the burden of loving monsters. My name is Theda Sterling. I'm 68 years old, and these days I spend my mornings tending to my little garden behind this cottage by the sea where nobody knows what these hands have done. Folks around here, they see an old woman who makes decent cornbread for the church socials and keeps to herself. Mostly. They don't see the woman who once stood in her hallway at 2 o'clock in the morning holding a service weapon with hands steadier than they'd ever been, knowing that what came next would either damn her soul or save it. You see, there's a difference between killing and protecting, though the law don't always see it that way. There's a difference between a mother and a murderer, though sometimes they live in the same body. And there's a difference between justice and revenge, though Lord help me, some nights I still can't tell which one I chose that October evening in Crescent, Pennsylvania, when the autumn leaves were falling like tears and my whole world turned inside out. I'm going to tell you this story because it needs telling, and because somewhere out there maybe there's another mama who needs to know she ain't alone in the darkness. Maybe there's someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most terrible thing you can do is also the most necessary, and that living with the aftermath takes a different kind of courage than pulling the trigger ever did. So settle in with me, honey. Pour yourself some sweet tea if you got it. And let an old woman's voice carry you back to a time when I thought I knew what family meant. When I believed good men wore badges and raised strong sons. And when the word home didn't taste like ashes in my mouth. Let me tell you about the night I became both killer and savior, and how I learned that sometimes love looks like letting everything burn, so one small light can survive. You know, for the longest time I thought I was living the American dream. Quentin was the deputy sheriff in our little town of Crescent. Population maybe 12,000 on a good day when the college kids came back from summer break. He had that kind of authority that made people step aside when he walked down Main Street, tipping their hats and saying, "Morning, Deputy Sterling," with genuine respect. And me, well, I was his wife. The woman who kept his uniforms pressed and his coffee hot, who smiled pretty at the county fair and made sure our family looked like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. We had ourselves a white 2-story house with green shutters on Maple Avenue, the kind of street where children rode bicycles and neighbors borrowed sugar from each other. Quentin would come home smelling like Old Spice and leather from his holster, telling me stories about his day while I fixed his plate. Our boy B, 18 and strong as an ox, was set to follow in his daddy's footsteps. Already had himself accepted to the police academy for the following fall. And then there was my sweet Lyra, 13 and pretty as a spring morning, with hair like spun gold and a laugh that could make the angels weep with joy. From the outside, Lord knows we looked blessed. Sunday mornings you'd find us in the third pew at First Baptist. Quentin's arm around my shoulders, the children scrubbed clean and sitting still as statues. I'd watch other families and think to myself how lucky I was, how God had seen fit to give me everything a woman could want. A husband with steady work, healthy children, a home that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. But you know what they say about still waters running deep? Well, sometimes they run dark. I started noticing things, little things at first. How Quentin's breath would smell sweet and sharp some evenings when he said he'd been working late. How he'd get phone calls that made him step outside to the porch. His voice dropping low like he was sharing secrets. How some mornings I'd wake up feeling foggy and strange, like I'd been swimming underwater in my sleep, though I couldn't remember taking so much as an aspirin. Though my firstborn, my pride and joy, he started changing too around that time. Got himself some expensive clothes. I know we didn't buy him. Started carrying around more cash than a boy his age should have. When I'd ask about it, he'd just smile, that charming smile of his, and say something about odd jobs for his daddy's friends, just helping out the community. Maid. Tell me, kissing my cheek like the good boy I thought he was. And my baby girl, my Lyra, sweet Jesus, that child started having nightmares that would wake the whole house. She'd scream herself awake. But when I'd run to her room, she couldn't tell me what scared her, so just sat there shaking, looking at me with eyes that seemed older than her years, like she'd seen things no child should ever see. I thought maybe it was just growing up. 13's a hard age for girls. I tried talking to Quentin about it, but he'd just wave his hand and say, girls were mysterious creatures, that she'd grow out of it. She's just sensitive. Theta, he'd tell me. Some kids are like that. But late at night, when I'd hear her crying through the walls, something in my mama's heart knew different. Something was eating at my baby from the inside out. The whole town thought we were perfect. And maybe that's what I wanted to believe too. Maybe I pushed down the little voice that whispered something wasn't right, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. When you've built your whole life on the foundation of believing in good men and safe homes, it's easier to explain away the cracks than to admit the whole thing might be rotten underneath. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed, all the warning bells I chose not to hear. But at the time, I was just a woman trying to hold her family together, trying to be grateful for what the Lord had given her, trying to believe that love was enough to keep the darkness at bay. I had no idea that the darkness wasn't coming from outside our home. It was already living there, sitting at our dinner table, sleeping in our beds, wearing the faces of the two people I trusted most in this world. And that's when everything started to fall apart, piece by terrible piece. The Sterling family had its rhythm, you see, like a well-rehearsed dance that we'd been performing for years. Quentin would leave for work before dawn, his boots heavy on the hardwood floors, the smell of coffee and aftershave lingering in the kitchen long after his patrol car pulled out of our driveway. Bo would slouch down to breakfast around 7. Always hungry, always in a hurry to get to school or wherever it was. 18-year-old boys disappeared too. And Elara, my sweet girl, she'd float down the stairs like morning mist, quiet and dreamy, picking at her toast while staring out the window at something only she could see. I thought I knew my family the way a woman knows her own heartbeat. Steady, reliable, predictable. Quentin had his moods. Sure enough, especially after he'd been drinking with the boys from the station, but he never raised a hand to me or the children. He was what folks in Crescent called a good provider, bringing home enough money to keep us comfortable, never missing a mortgage payment or letting the lights get cut off. He'd ruffle Lyra's hair when he passed her chair at dinner, ask Bo about his grades, tell me my pot roast was the best in the county. Bo was turning into a man right before my eyes, all broad shoulders and cocky grins, full of plans about joining the police force and making his daddy proud. He'd taken to staying out later, coming home with stories about helping elderly neighbors with their groceries or fixing Mrs. Henderson's fence. Such a good boy, I'd think to myself. Raised him right. He was protective of his little sister too, always walking her to school when Quentin couldn't, always making sure she got home safe when I was working late at the diner. That's what made it so hard. See. At first, they were both so attentive to Lyra. Too attentive, maybe. But at the time it just looked like love. Quentin would bring her little gifts from town, hair ribbons and candy, telling her she was his special girl. Bea would spend hours helping her with homework, patient as a saint when she struggled with her math. They'd both tuck her in at night sometimes, taking turns reading her stories or just sitting with her until she fell asleep. Looking back, I can see how careful they were about it all. How they never did anything that would raise suspicions from neighbors or teachers. How they made sure I was always busy or distracted when they had their special time with Lyra. Quentin would send me to the grocery store or to visit my sister across town. Ba would suggest I take a nice long bath while he helped Lyra with her project upstairs. They orchestrated it all like a symphony. And I was too trusting, too grateful for their help to hear the discord underneath the melody. The money started showing up in little ways. Quentin bringing home steaks instead of hamburger. Talking about a bonus from the department. New tools appearing in the garage that he said came from a grateful citizen whose property he'd recovered. Bo started dressing better. His old hand-me-downs replaced with name brand clothes he claimed came from a friend whose family had money to burn. When I'd asked questions, they'd share these knowing looks like they had some wonderful secret they weren't quite ready to share with me yet. I was proud of them, if I'm being honest. Proud to have a husband who was so respected in the community, so trusted by his colleagues, proud to have raised a son who was following in his father's footsteps, learning what it meant to serve and protect. They seemed closer than ever during those months, bonding over their shared commitment to law enforcement, spending hours talking about cases and procedures and the weight of responsibility that came with wearing a badge. The only shadow on our happiness was Lyra's growing sadness. Bright, chattering little girl became quiet and withdrawn, spending more time in her room, losing interest in the things that used to make her smile. Her grades started slipping, and her teacher, Mrs. Morrison, called to say she seemed distracted in class, like her mind was always somewhere else. When I'd ask her what was wrong, she'd just shake her head and say she was tired or that nothing was wrong at all. But children can't hide their pain the way adults do. And I started noticing things that made my heart clench with worry. How she'd flinch sometimes when Quentin or Bo would reach over to touch her hair. How she'd gotten in the habit of locking her bedroom door at night, something she'd never done before. How she'd started having those terrible nightmares that left her gasping and crying, though she could never remember what had scared her so badly. I took her to see Dr. Albee, thinking maybe she was getting maybe there was something physical causing her distress. He was an old-fashioned country doctor who'd delivered half the babies in Crescent and knew every family's medical history by heart. After examining Lyra, he asked to speak with me privately in his office. And that's when my world started tilting sideways. The words he spoke that day, I can still hear them echoing in my mind 15 years later. Medical terms I didn't understand at first. Gentle explanations that gradually became crystal clear. Evidence that couldn't be argued with or explained away. My baby girl, my innocent 13-year-old daughter, had been violated in ways that made my stomach turn and my heart break into 1,000 pieces. But even then, even with the proof right there in black and white, I couldn't let myself believe the truth that was staring me in the face. The drive home from Dr. Alb's office felt like swimming through thick honey, every mile stretching out like an eternity, while his words kept echoing in my head. Physical evidence, it said. recent trauma signs that pointed to ongoing abuse. I gripped that steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white, trying to make sense of what couldn't possibly make sense. Who would hurt my baby? Who had access to her? Who did she trust enough to? That's when the cold truth started seeping into my bones like winter fog. I pulled into our driveway and just sat there for the longest time, staring at our perfect white house with its green shutters and the little flower boxes I'd planted last spring. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I'd left for Lyra's appointment. But somehow it all felt different now, like I was seeing it through different eyes. The swing on the front porch where Quentin liked to sit with his evening beer. The upstairs window to Lyra's room where she'd started keeping the curtains drawn tight. The garage where he spent so much time these days working on what he called his projects. When I finally went inside, they were both there in the kitchen, looking for all the world like the loving father and brother they'd always seemed to be. Quentin asked how the doctor's visit went. His face creased with what looked like genuine concern. Bo looked up from his homework and wanted to know if his little sister was feeling better. Such normal questions, such caring expressions, such perfect performances. Told them what Dr. Albee had said about Lyra needing rest and maybe some vitamins for her tiredness. But all the while I was studying their faces, looking for something I'd never looked for before. A flicker of guilt maybe, or fear, or the kind of knowledge that only comes from doing terrible things in the dark. But they just nodded and made sympathetic noises and went back to their business like nothing had changed. That night I started paying attention in ways I never had before. I noticed how Quentin's eyes would follow Lyra when she moved around the kitchen. How they'd linger on her in ways that made my skin crawl. Once I really saw it, I noticed how Ba would find excuses to brush past her to touch her shoulder or her hand. Casual little contacts that suddenly didn't seem casual at all. I noticed how they both knew exactly where she was at every moment, like they were keeping track of her movements. And I noticed how careful they were around me. How they'd changed the subject when I walked into a room. How they'd share these quick glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Like they had secrets, like they had something to hide. The pieces started falling into place with a horrible kind of clarity. All those times Quentin had sent me out on errands. All those occasions when Bo had volunteered to babysit while I visited my sister or worked late at the diner. All those nights when I'd wake up feeling strange and disoriented like I'd been drugged. All that extra money they claimed came from overtime and odd jobs. I started finding things. Camera hidden behind some books in Ba's room. Strange cables and equipment in the garage that Quentin said were for police work. Cash hidden in places where cash had no business being. And photographs, Lord help me. Photographs that made me understand exactly what had been happening in my house while I slept, while I worked, while I trusted. The worst part wasn't discovering what they'd done to Lyra. The worst part was realizing how long it had been going on, how organized they were about it, how they'd turned my sweet baby girl into their victim while I cooked their meals and washed their clothes and thanked God every night for blessing me with such a loving family. They weren't just abusing her. They were selling her pain to other monsters, recording her suffering for money, turning our home into a business where innocence was the product and my daughter was the inventory. I should have confronted them right then. Have called the police, though Lord knows how that would have gone, with Quentin being one of their own. Have grabbed Lyra and run as far and fast as we could go. But I didn't do any of those things because I was still that woman who'd spent 20 years believing in the goodness of the men she loved. still trying to find some other explanation. That wouldn't require me to accept that I'd been living with devils. So I watched and I planned and I prayed to a God who seemed to have forgotten all about us. But mostly I got ready to do something I never thought I'd have the strength to do. The final straw came 3 nights later when I heard that soft electronic beeping coming from Lyra's room, the sound of recording equipment starting up. I crept down the hallway in my bare feet, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they'd hear it, and peered through the crack in her bedroom door. What I saw there burned itself into my memory like a brand, and I knew right then that there was no going back. No more hoping for the best. No more trusting in the goodness of men who had none left in them. I was done being the woman who looked the other way. I was ready to become the woman who would do whatever it took to save her child, even if it meant damning her own soul in the process. That night, October 15th, though sometimes I think it was the 16th, my memory gets fuzzy when the pain gets too deep. I didn't sleep at all. Just lay there in my bed, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows, waiting for the house to settle into that deep quiet that comes just before. Quentin was snoring beside me, dead to the world after what he'd called a long day serving the community. I remember thinking how peaceful he looked, how innocent, like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. I'd been carrying this terrible knowledge for 72 hours by then, and it felt like swallowing glass every time I had to look at him. Every time I had to pretend everything was normal, making his coffee that morning, scrambling his eggs just the way he liked them, asking about his plans for the day like I was still the beautiful wife who believed in his goodness. All the while, my hands were shaking so bad I had to grip the spatula tight to keep from dropping it. The hardest part was looking at Beau, my firstborn, the baby I'd rocked to sleep for countless nights. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. He sat at that breakfast table eating my pancakes and talking about some football game he wanted to watch. And all I could see was the monster he'd become. The way he'd learned cruelty from his father. The way they'd worked together to destroy the one pure thing in our family. Lyra barely touched her food that morning. Just pushed it around on her plate while staring at nothing. She'd gotten so thin, my baby girl, so pale and quiet. When she asked if she could stay home from school because her stomach hurt, I almost said yes. Lord knows I wanted to keep her close to wrap her up and protect her from what was coming. Then Quentin chimed in about how education was important and missing school was a bad habit to get into. Something about the way he said it, like he had plans for her that day, made my blood run cold. So I sent her off to school with her lunch packed and her backpack heavy with books. And I kissed her forehead and told her I loved her more than all the stars in the sky. She looked at me funny when I said that, like she knew something was different about the way I held her just a little too long. The way my voice cracked on the word love. Maybe children can sense when their world's about to change forever. After they all left, I walked through that house like I was seeing it. For the first time. Really seeing it. Not through the eyes of a woman who wanted to believe in fairy tales, but through the eyes of someone who finally understood what had been happening under my own roof. The basement where he spent so much time with his projects. I found the rest of the equipment down there. Cameras and lights and things I won't describe because some horrors don't need repeating. Found the money too. Thousands of dollars hidden in places I'd never thought to look. Bundled up in manila envelopes and stuffed behind loose boards in the garage. Money earned from selling pieces of my daughter's childhood to strangers who paid good cash for innocence destroyed. But it was The videos I found that broke something inside me that can never be fixed. Hours and hours of footage, some going back months, maybe years, my sweet baby girl, unconscious from whatever they'd given her, violated in ways that would make Satan himself weep with shame. And there they were, my husband and my son, treating her like she was nothing more than a product to be sold, a thing to be used. I sat on the floor of that basement for I don't know how long, holding those tapes and crying tears that felt like they'd burn my face right off, praying to God to tell me what to do, how to fix this, how to make it stop without destroying what was left of our family. But God was quiet that day. Or maybe he was just waiting for me to find the courage I'd need for what came next. When evening rolled around, they all came home like it was any other day. Quentin with stories from the station, Beau with homework to pretend to do, Lyra pale and quiet and picking at her dinner. I cooked pork chops and mashed potatoes and green beans, the same meal I'd made 100 times before, and we sat around that table like the loving family we'd never really been. I waited until they'd settled in for the night. Waited until Quentin had his evening beers, and Beau was supposedly doing homework in his room. Waited until the house got that particular kind of quiet that meant they thought I was asleep and helpless and none the wiser. That's when I heard the beeping again, that soft electronic sound that meant they were setting up their equipment, getting ready to hurt my baby one more time. I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway. And this time I wasn't just watching through a crack in the door. This time I was ready to end it all. Won't lie and say I wasn't scared. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold on to Quentin's service weapon when I took it from his holster. But sometimes love looks like violence. And sometimes protecting what's innocent means destroying what's evil. And sometimes a mother has to become something terrible to save her child from something worse. What happened next changed everything for me, for Lyra, for our whole town. But it also saved the only part of our family that was worth saving. And that's when I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is the most unforgivable. The gunshots echoed through our house like thunder. 18 of them in total. Boy, couldn't tell you exactly how many went into Quentin and how many into Beau when you're watching the devil die. Don't stop to count bullets. You just keep pulling that trigger until the evil stops breathing. The silence that followed was deeper than anything I'd ever heard. Like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of woman I'd become. In those few terrible minutes, Lyra woke up screaming, of course, found me standing in her doorway with that smoking gun in my hands. My nightgown splattered with blood that wasn't mine, looking like some kind of avenging angel, or maybe just a woman who'd finally snapped. She was still groggy from whatever they'd given her. I found out later it was some kind of sedative Quentin had been stealing from the evidence locker at work, but she was awake enough to see what I'd done to protect her. The thing about small towns like Crescent is that gunshots travel fast, and within minutes we had half the police force pounding on our front door. I sent Lyra to her room and told her not to come out no matter what she heard. Then I walked downstairs and opened that door like I was welcoming Sunday visitors. Handed over the weapon without a fight. Let them put those cold handcuffs around my wrists. Listened to them read me my rights in voices that shook because they'd never arrested a deputy sheriff's widow before. Chief Morrison, Mrs. Morrison's husband from Lyra School. He kept asking me why I'd done it. What could possibly drive a woman to kill her own family? But how do you explain to a room full of men that sometimes murder is mercy? Do you tell them that the real crime had been happening for months, maybe years, while they all thought Quentin Sterling was one of the good guys. They took me to the station in the back of a patrol car, past neighbors who'd gathered on their porches to watch the show. Mrs. Henderson from next door had her hands over her mouth like she was trying to hold back her shock. Old Mr. Peterson was shaking his head like he couldn't believe what the world was coming to. Saw it all through those windows, watching my reputation die right alongside the men I'd killed. I found I didn't care one bit about what those people thought of me anymore. The holding cell was smaller than my pantry. Back home with concrete walls that wept moisture and a cot that smelled like despair and disinfectant, I sat on that thin mattress and stared at my hands. The same hands that had braided Lyra's hair that morning, that had made countless meals for the monsters I'd married and raised, that had pulled the trigger 18 times without hesitation. They looked like strangers' hands, like they belonged to someone harder and more dangerous than the woman I'd been just hours before. But while I was sitting in that cell, something beautiful was happening that I wouldn't learn about until much later. Detective Sarah Winters from the state police had been called in to investigate, and being a woman who'd seen too many children hurt by the people who were supposed to protect them, she knew what to look for. When she searched our house, she found everything. The cameras, the money, the videos, the evidence that painted a picture so ugly it made grown men cry. By the time they'd processed that crime scene, the whole narrative had changed. I wasn't just a woman who snapped and killed her family anymore. I was a mother who discovered that her husband and son were running a child pornography operation out of their own home using her unconscious daughter as their main victim. The investigation revealed connections to other Redditors across 3 states, a network of evil that had been operating right under everyone's noses while Quentin smiled and waved and served the community. The prosecutor, young man named David Chen, who had daughters of his own, took one look at the evidence and knew he couldn't put me away for protecting my child. The defense attorney they assigned me, Patricia Webb, had been fighting for women and children her whole career, and she understood exactly what had happened in our house that October night. Between the two of them, they built a case that showed the world who the real criminals were. But the most important voice in all of it was Lise, my brave, broken baby girl who had to tell strangers in suits about the worst things that had ever happened to her, who had to relive her nightmare so that justice could be served. She testified about the drugs they'd given her, about waking up confused and sore with no memory of what had been done to her body. She told them about the fear that had been eating her alive, the nightmares that wouldn't stop, the way she'd started to feel like she was losing her mind. And she told them about the sound of gunshots that night and how for the first time in months she'd felt safe in her own home. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the verdict took the jury less than 2 hours to reach. Not guilty by reason of justified homicide. Not guilty because a mother has the right to protect her child by any means necessary. Not guilty because sometimes the law recognizes that there are worse things than death. And what Quentin and Beau had been doing to Lyra was one of them. I walked out of that courthouse a free woman. But freedom felt different than I'd expected. The town that had once respected the Sterling family name now whispered about us wherever we went. Some people looked at me like I was a hero. Others like I was a killer who'd gotten away with murder. Most just looked at me with pity like I was something broken that couldn't be fixed. But there was something else I discovered in those weeks between the shooting and the trial. Something that nobody expected. We weren't the only family they'd been destroying. Letters started coming 3 days after the trial ended. Delivered to the courthouse where Patricia Webb still had her office, forwarded to the little motel where Lyra and I had been staying since we couldn't bear to go back to that house on Maple Avenue. Handwritten notes on flowery stationery, emails printed out on copy paper, even a few packages with return addresses I didn't recognize. All from women who'd seen the news coverage and recognized something in our story that hit too close to home. The first one was from a mother in Pittsburgh whose 12-year-old son had been acting strange after spending weekends with his father, a police officer who'd recently been promoted to detective. She'd noticed the same signs I'd missed for so long. The nightmares, the withdrawn behavior, the way her child had started flinching when men got too close. She'd taken him to a doctor too, and found the same terrible evidence Dr. Albee had found with Lyra. But when she tried to report it, her ex-husband's fellow officers had closed ranks, said she was just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause trouble. The second letter came from a grandmother in Ohio who'd been raising her granddaughter after the child's parents died in a car wreck. She'd started noticing that her brother-in-law, a respected sheriff's deputy, paid too much attention to the little girl during family gatherings. The child had started wetting the bed again, had become afraid of the dark, had begged not to be left alone with Uncle Mike. But family was family, and who was she to make accusations without proof? More letters came every day after that. Women from small towns across Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, places where law enforcement officers were pillars of the community, where good Christian families didn't talk about ugly things that happened behind closed doors, stories of children who'd been silenced by fear, mothers who'd been dismissed as hysterical, grandmothers who'd been told they were imagining things. But the letter that broke my heart came from a woman named Grace Thompson in a little town called Millfield, about 200 m south of Crescent. Her story was almost identical to mine. A husband who was a deputy sheriff, a teenage son who was following in daddy's footsteps, a 13-year-old daughter who had started having nightmares and losing weight and pulling away from everyone who tried to help her. Grace had suspected something was wrong, but every time she tried to investigate, her husband would send her away on some errand, or her son would volunteer to watch his sister while Mama took care of business. The difference was that Grace hadn't found the courage to look closer, hadn't discovered the cameras or the money or the videos, hadn't walked down that hallway with a loaded gun in her hands. Her daughter, Emma, had finally been found by a neighbor hanging from a rope in the family barn with a note that simply said, "I'm sorry I couldn't be braver." Grace's letter was 10 pages long, written in shaky handwriting that looked like it had been blurred by tears. She told me about the investigation that followed Emma's death, how they'd finally found all the evidence hidden in her house, how her husband and son were now serving life sentences for what they'd done not just to Emma, but to 6 other children in their community. She told me about the guilt that ate at her every single day, knowing she could have saved her baby if she'd just been willing to see what was right in front of her. And she told me something that made my blood run cold all over again. There were more of them, more networks, more families where fathers and sons worked together to destroy innocence for profit. The investigation into Quentin and Bose's operation had uncovered connections to predators in 12 states. Men who treated children like commodities and treated their own families like livestock to be harvested. Detective Winters called me a week later to tell me what they'd found on Quentin's computer. Communications with dozens of other men, some of them law enforcement officers, some of them teachers and coaches and scout leaders, men who had access to children and used that access to build a business that thrived on pain. They'd been planning to expand their operation to recruit more families to turn child abuse into a cottage industry that would make them all rich. The FBI had taken over the investigation by then, following trails of evidence that led to houses that looked just like ours. Normal suburban homes where normal-looking families lived normal-looking lives while committing crimes that would make hardened criminals sick to their stomachs. Some of the children they found were rescued in time. Others, like little Emma Thompson, had decided death was preferable to one more day of being used and violated by the people who were supposed to love them. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Not because of guilt over what I had done, but because of rage over what I hadn't done sooner. How many other children could I have saved if I'd been braver earlier? How many other mothers were going to have to make the choice between being killers and being complicit? How many more little girls were going to give up hope because the adults in their lives were too scared or too trusting or too weak to protect them? Lyra was getting stronger every day. Finally able to sleep through the night without waking, screaming. Finally able to eat a full meal without her hands shaking. Martinez, the trauma specialist we'd found in Pittsburgh, said she was making remarkable progress considering what she'd been through. But sometimes I'd catch her staring at nothing with that old haunted look in her eyes. And I knew the scars would never completely fade. We'd started talking about leaving Pennsylvania, maybe heading somewhere warm where nobody knew our names or our story. California, maybe. Or Florida. Somewhere we could disappear and start over as different people with different histories. The insurance money from Quentin's death would be enough to get us settled somewhere new. And Lyra was smart enough to catch up on the schooling she'd missed during the worst of her trauma. But then, Detective Winters called with news that changed everything again. They'd found something else in Quentin's files, something that made me understand just how deep this evil went and how many lives were still hanging in the balance. And suddenly, running away and starting over seemed like the most selfish thing I could possibly do. Detective Winters drove out to see us on a Tuesday morning in November. The kind of gray day when winter starts settling into your bones and won't let go. I could tell by the way she walked up to our motel room door that whatever she had to tell me wasn't going to be something I wanted to hear. She had that careful look people get when they're carrying bad news. Like she was trying to figure out how to break another piece of my world without shattering what little was left. We sat at the tiny table by the window drinking coffee from styrofoam cups while Lyra was at her appointment with Dr. Martinez Sarah. She'd asked me to call her by her first name after everything we'd been through. Spread out a manila folder full of papers and photographs. Her hands steady even though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She'd been working this case around the clock for weeks, following every lead, chasing down every connection, trying to map out just how far this network of monsters really reached. The first thing she showed me was a list of names, maybe 40 or 50 of them, all connected to the evidence they'd found on Quentin's computer. Police officers, teachers, youth pastors, little league coaches. Little league coaches around having access to children who'd used that trust to create opportunities for evil. Of them were already behind bars, caught in the web that started unraveling when I pulled that trigger. Others were still out there, still in positions of authority, still able to hurt kids because the investigation was moving slowly, and the law required proof that sometimes took months or years to gather. But it was the second thing she showed me that made my stomach drop to the floor. A photograph of 3 little girls, all around Lyra's age, all with that same haunted look my daughter had worn for so many months. Their names were written on the back in Quentin's neat handwriting: Amy, Jessica, and Chloe. Underneath their names, he'd written dates and dollar amounts like they were inventory items in some nightmare catalog. Sarah's voice was quiet when she told me what they'd discovered. These 3 girls lived in a town called Cedar Grove, about 4 hours north of Cresman, with their fathers, who all happened to work for the same sheriff's department. The girls had been reported as runaways by their families, but the FBI suspected they hadn't run away at all. They'd been sold, traded to collectors who paid premium prices for children who wouldn't be missed, who'd already been broken in by their own families. The worst part was that the investigation had to move carefully. Cedar Grove was a tight-knit community, where the sheriff's department was respected and trusted, where asking too many questions about missing children might spook the predators and cause them to destroy evidence or harm the kids who were still alive. The FBI needed someone who could get close to the families without raising suspicions. Someone who could gather information while appearing to be nothing more than a concerned citizen or a fellow parent. That's when Sarah looked me straight in the eye and asked me to do something I never thought I'd have the courage for. She wanted me to go to Cedar Grove, to move there temporarily, maybe get a job at the local diner or the school cafeteria to become part of the community while keeping my eyes and ears open. The families of those 3 missing girls would trust me, she said, 'cause I was a mother who'd been through trauma, someone who understood their pain. They might tell me things they'd never tell. Law enforcement might share details that could help locate the missing children. My first instinct was to say no. Lyra had been through enough, and the idea of putting her in another small town where dangerous men might recognize us seemed like asking for trouble. We'd already paid our dues to justice, hadn't we? We'd done our part by exposing Quentin and Bose's operation. Why should we have to risk our safety to help save other children when we were barely holding ourselves together? But then Sarah showed me one more photograph and everything changed. It was a picture of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with blonde curls and blue eyes and a smile that reminded me so much of Lyra at that age that it took my breath away. Her name was Sophie, and according to the evidence they'd found, she was Quentin's special project, a child he'd been grooming for months, planning to add to his collection once he finished breaking her down. She lived in Cedar Grove with her single mother, who worked double shifts at the hospital, leaving Sophie in the care of her uncle, who just happened to be Deputy Frank Morrison. Sarah told me that Sophie had started showing the same signs: the nightmares, the withdrawn behavior, the fear of being left alone with family members. Her mother had noticed the changes, but didn't know what to make of them, especially since Uncle Frank seemed so concerned about Sophie's welfare and was always volunteering to help take care of her. Looking at that little girl's photograph, I could see Lyra's face superimposed over hers. I could imagine all the children who were living through what my daughter had survived. All the mothers who didn't know their homes had become hunting grounds for their own family members. I thought about Emma Thompson and the rope in the barn, about all the children who'd given up hope because the adults in their lives had failed to protect them. That night I sat on the edge of the motel bed and watched Lyra sleep peacefully for the first time in months. She'd been healing so well, getting stronger every day, starting to believe that she might have a future worth living. Taking her to Cedar Grove would mean risking all that progress, exposing her to potential danger, asking her to be brave one more time when she'd already been braver than any child should ever have to be. But it would also mean giving her something powerful, the chance to help save other children, to turn her survival into purpose, to know that her pain hadn't been meaningless if it could prevent other kids from suffering the same fate. When I finally asked her what she thought about Sarah's proposal, Lyra was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at me with eyes that seemed older than her 14 years and said something that broke my heart and made me proud all at the same time. She said she'd been having dreams about other little girls who were trapped in dark places, calling for help that wasn't coming. She said maybe God had let her live through hell so she could help rescue some angels. That's when I knew we weren't done fighting yet. Cedar Grove looked like every other small American town I'd ever seen. The kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on. Main Street had a hardware store that had been family-owned for 3 generations, a diner with checkered tablecloths and coffee that could wake the dead, and a courthouse with a flagpole where the stars and stripes snapped in the autumn wind. You didn't know what to look for. You'd think it was the perfect place to raise a family. We'd been there 2 weeks, living in a little furnished apartment above Murphy's 5 and Dime when I got the job at Rosie's Diner on the corner of Main and Elm. The owner, a woman named Helen Kowalski, who'd been slinging hash for 30 years, hired me on the spot. When I told her I'd been a waitress before my husband died and I needed steady work to support my daughter, didn't ask too many questions about where we'd come from or why we'd chosen Cedar Grove. Small towns are full of people running from something, and she'd learned not to pry. The first week at Rosie's was like stepping back in time. The customers were mostly locals. Farmers who came in for breakfast before heading to their fields, office workers who grabbed lunch between appointments, retired folks who treated the diner like their personal social club. They were friendly enough, accepting me with a cautious warmth that small towns reserve for newcomers who seemed harmless and hardworking. It didn't take long to identify the families Sarah had told me about. The Morrisons came in every Sunday after church. Deputy Frank with his nervous-looking wife Carol and their 10-year-old niece Sophie who barely spoke above a whisper and jumped whenever someone raised their voice. The Hendersons were regulars too. Sheriff Pete Henderson and his quiet teenage daughter Amy Vuchedame, who should have been a sophomore in high school but hadn't been seen around town for months. Her father claimed she'd gone to live with relatives in another state. There was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl. I watched those families with the eyes of a mother who'd learned to see evil hiding behind ordinary faces. Deputy Morrison doted on little Sophie in ways that looked loving to outsiders, but made my stomach turn the way he'd stroke her hair while she ate. How he'd insist on cutting her meat for her like she was helpless. The possessive way he'd keep his hand on her shoulder when they walked. Sheriff Henderson talked about his missing daughter with a kind of detachment that suggested she was more of a business transaction than a beloved child. Lyra had enrolled in Cedar Grove Middle School under the name Carmen Rivera. We'd gotten new identities through a program for domestic violence survivors, complete with social security numbers and school records. She was doing well, making friends cautiously, participating in class discussions for the first time in over a year. But I could see her watching the adults around her with the same suspicious eyes I'd developed, cataloging behavior that might indicate danger, always ready to run if necessary. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into our stay when Sophie Morrison's mother, Jennifer, came into the diner. Alone one afternoon, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She ordered coffee and pie, but just picked at her food, staring out the window with the hollow expression of a woman carrying too much weight. I refilled her cup twice before she finally started talking. Maybe because I was a stranger who couldn't judge her. Or maybe because mothers recognize something in each other when their children are in trouble. She told me about Sophie's nightmares about finding the child crying in her bedroom for no reason she could explain. About how Sophie had stopped wanting to visit Uncle Frank and Aunt Carol, making excuses about feeling sick or having too much homework. About the way her bright, chattering little girl had become quiet and withdrawn, flinching away from physical contact, even from her own mother. But what made my blood run cold was when Jennifer mentioned the money Uncle Frank had been helping with Sophie's expenses lately, paying for new clothes and shoes, offering to cover the costs of dance lessons and summer camp. He said he wanted to help out since Jennifer was struggling as a single mother. Said Sophie was like the daughter he'd never had. Such generous offers from such a caring uncle who wouldn't be grateful for that kind of family support. I listened to Jennifer talk about her brother-in-law's kindness. While every instinct developed screamed danger, I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she understood what was happening. But I knew that would only mark me as crazy and destroy any chance of helping Sophie. Instead, I made sympathetic noises and offered to babysit sometime if she ever needed a break, planting the seed of an idea that might give me access to the child. That night, I called Detective Winters and told her what I'd learned. The FBI had been building their case slowly, carefully, but they needed more concrete evidence before they could move against the Cedar Grove network. Children's lives hung in the balance, and one wrong step could cause the predators to scatter or, worse, to eliminate the evidence by harming the kids they'd been abusing. Sarah asked me if I was prepared to take the next step to get close enough to the Morrison family to document what was happening to Sophie, to gather the kind of proof that would hold up in court and put Frank Morrison behind bars forever. It would mean putting myself and Lyra at risk, getting involved in ways that could turn dangerous if we were discovered. But as I looked at Lyra, sleeping peacefully in the next room, I thought about all the nights she'd woken up screaming, all the months she'd lived in terror while I remained blind to her suffering. I thought about Emma Thompson and her rope, about little Sophie Morrison and her forced smiles, about all the children who were counting on adults to be brave enough to save them. I thought about the choice I'd made that October night with 18 bullets, and I realized that sometimes love requires you to keep choosing violence against evil, even when you're tired of fighting, even when you just want to heal and move on. Some battles don't end with a single victory. Some monsters grow back their heads faster than you can cut them off. And sometimes being a mother means becoming a warrior over and over again for as long as children need saving. The next morning I called Jennifer Morrison and offered to babysit Sophie that weekend. It was time to gather some evidence. Saturday evening came with a kind of November chill that cuts right through your bones and makes you grateful for warm kitchens and hot coffee. Jennifer Morrison dropped Sophie off at our apartment just after 6, apologizing for the short notice, but explaining that she'd gotten called in for an extra shift at the hospital and didn't have anywhere else to turn. Frank had offered to watch Sophie like he always did, but something in Jennifer's eyes told me she was starting to have doubts about leaving her daughter alone with him. Sophie was a tiny thing, all blonde curls and big blue eyes that seemed too old for her 10-year-old face. She reminded me so much of Lyra at that age that it physically hurt to look at her sometimes. She was polite and quiet, the way children get when they've learned that drawing attention to themselves can be dangerous. She said, "Please and thank you," in a whisper, soft voice, and kept her hands folded in her lap like she was afraid of taking up too much space in the world. Lyra had Been looking forward to this all week. Excited to have a younger child to care for and protect. She'd cleaned our little apartment from top to bottom, bought coloring books and crayons with her allowance money, even baked cookies, using the tiny oven in our kitchenette. Watching her with Sophie was like seeing my daughter transform back into the nurturing, joyful child she'd been before Quentin and bestole her innocence. We made dinner together. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Nothing fancy, but the kind of comfort food that makes a house feel like home. Sophie ate slowly, carefully, like she wasn't sure when her next meal might come. She answered our questions with single words or nods, but I caught her watching Lyra with something that looked like hope in her eyes, maybe recognizing another survivor when she saw one. It was around 8 o'clock when the knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps followed by a voice I recognized from the diner, calling out that it was Deputy Morrison here to pick up his news. My heart started hammering so hard I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. But I forced myself to stay calm, to act like nothing was wrong, even though every instinct I had was screaming danger. Sophie's reaction told me everything I needed to know. She went pale as paper and started backing toward the far corner of the room, shaking her head in tiny, terrified movements. Lyra moved to stand between Sophie and the door, her jaw set with the kind of determination I'd seen in the mirror that October night when I'd made my choice about protecting my child. I opened the door just wide enough to see Frank Morrison standing there in his uniform, badge gleaming in the hallway lights, looking for all the world like the upstanding law enforcement officer everyone believed him to be. He was a big man, maybe 6 feet 2 inches and broad through the shoulders, with graying hair and the kind of mustache that belonged on wanted posters from the Old West. When he smiled at me, I could see how he'd fooled so many people for so long. There was genuine warmth in that expression, the practiced charm of a predator who'd learned to make people trust him. He explained that Jennifer had called him from the hospital, worried about imposing on a new neighbor, and wanting to make sure Sophie got home safely. Thoughtful brother-in-law. Such a caring uncle, so concerned about family obligations. He apologized for the inconvenience and reached around me to call for Sophie to come along. Time to go home. That's when Sophie did something that broke my heart and made me prouder than I'd ever been of any child's courage. She looked Frank Morrison straight in the eye and said in a voice barely louder than a whisper that she wanted to stay with me and Lyra tonight. She said she'd had fun playing games and doing puzzles, and could she please stay just a little longer. The mask slipped for just a second. I saw Frank's jaw tighten and his eyes go cold. The way predators look when their prey tries to escape. But then he was all smiles again, chuckling about how children could be so stubborn when they were having fun, saying, of course, Sophie needed to come home because it was a school night and her mother would be worried. I had about 10 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether Sophie Morrison ended up like my LRA scarred but alive, or like Emma Thompson who decided death was preferable to one more night of abuse. 10 seconds to decide whether I was going to play it safe and hand this child over to her monster, or whether I was going to risk everything to save her. Looking at Sophie's terrified face, feeling Lyra's protective presence behind me, remembering all those other children whose photographs were hidden in Frank Morrison's files, I made my choice. I told Frank that Sophie was welcome to spend the night, that I'd already called Jennifer at the hospital to confirm it was okay. A lie, of course, but delivered with the confidence of a woman who'd learned to be dangerous when children's lives were on the line. I said Sophie could sleep on our couch, And I'd make sure she got to school on time in the morning. No trouble at all. Frank's smile got tighter and I could see him calculating his options. He couldn't force his way into my apartment without cause. Not while wearing that uniform. Not in a building where other tenants might see. But he also couldn't let Sophie spend the night somewhere he couldn't control. Couldn't risk her talking to people who might ask the wrong questions or notice the right. That's when he made his mistake. That's when the predator in him overruled the cautious law enforcement officer and he decided to try intimidation instead of charm. He stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and see the cold calculation in his eyes. He lowered his voice to a whisper and told me that I didn't understand the situation, that Sophie was his responsibility and he wouldn't have some stranger interfering with family business. He suggested that newcomers to Cedar Grove should be careful about making waves, especially when they had children of their own to protect. It was a threat, plain and simple. Promise that if I didn't hand Sophie over right now, both Lyra and I might find ourselves in danger from someone who had a badge and a gun and the respect of the entire community. But Frank Morrison had made one crucial error in judgment. He'd threatened my daughter, and I was a woman who'd already killed 2 monsters to protect my child. I wasn't about to let a third one walk away with the power to hurt us. I stepped back into the apartment and told Frank that Sophie was staying the night. End of discussion. Then I did something that probably saved all our lives. I pulled out my phone and started recording, making sure he could see the red light. That meant everything he said and did from that moment on would be preserved forever. The rage that crossed his face was like watching Satan himself take off his human mask. For a split second, I thought he might try to force his way inside. Might decide that 3 potential witnesses were easier to silence than one scared little girl. But then he seemed to remember where he was, who might be watching, what the consequences would be if he was caught on camera assaulting civilians. He stepped back, straightened his uniform, and told me in a voice like poisoned honey that this wasn't over, that I'd made a serious mistake interfering with police business, that tomorrow we'd discuss this situation when cooler heads could prevail. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the 3 of us standing there shaking with adrenaline and fear, and the terrible knowledge that we'd just declared war on a monster who had the entire town's trust and respect. But for the first time since we'd arrived in Cedar Grove, Sophie Morrison smiled like she meant it. And I knew that whatever came next, we'd crossed the line. There was no going back from that night. None of us slept much. Sophie curled up on our little couch with every light in the apartment burning, clutching a stuffed rabbit that Lyra had given her and jumping at every sound from the hallway. I sat by the window with my phone in one hand and the kitchen knife in the other, watching the street below for any sign that Frank Morrison might come back with reinforcements or explanations that would force me to hand Sophie over. But the real surprise came at dawn when Detective Sarah Winters called to tell me that everything had changed overnight in ways none of us could have predicted. Frank Morrison was dead. They'd found him in his patrol car on a back road outside of town. Single gunshot wound to the head. His service weapon missing from his holster. First, Sarah said it looked like suicide. The guilt and pressure of the investigation finally catching up with him, maybe. But then they'd found something in his home that painted a completely different picture of what had happened. A safe hidden behind a false wall in his basement, filled with photographs and videos and documents that made Quentin and Bao's operation look like amateur hour. Frank Morrison hadn't just been abusing Sophie and selling her pain to strangers. He'd been running the entire Cedar Grove network, coordinating with predators across 6 states, managing a business that had been operating for over a decade. The evidence they found implicated sheriff's deputies, school administrators, youth pastors, and even a family court judge who'd been placing vulnerable children in homes where they could be easily exploited. But the real shock was what they discovered about Amy Henderson, Jessica Collins, and Chloe Martinez, the 3 runaway girls, whose photographs I'd seen in Sarah's files. They weren't dead, and they hadn't been sold to collectors like the FBI had feared. They were alive, hidden in a compound about 50 miles outside of Cedar Grove, being held by a group of women who'd been rescuing children from the network for years. The women called themselves the Guardians, and their leader was someone I never would have expected. Grace Thompson, the mother from Millfield, whose daughter Emma had died by suicide rather than endure another day of abuse. After losing Emma, Grace had dedicated her life to saving other children, building a network of mothers and grandmothers and sisters who'd learned to fight back against the monsters in their own families. They'd been watching Frank Morrison for months, gathering evidence, planning their move. When they learned that he was escalating his abuse of Sophie, getting ready to add her to his stable of children for sale, they decided it was time to act. Grace herself had been the one to put that bullet in Frank's head, just like I'd put 18 bullets into Quentin and Beau. Sometimes, she told Sarah, justice doesn't come from courtrooms. It comes from mothers who refused to let evil prosper. The compound where they'd hidden the rescued children was like something out of a dream, place where traumatized kids could heal without fear of being found by the predators who'd hurt them. Amy and Jessica and Chloe were all there along with 7 other children who'd been saved from similar situations across multiple states. They had counselors and teachers and medical care, everything they needed to recover from their trauma and build new lives, with new identities in places where their abusers could never find them. Grace offered to take Sophie there to give her the same chance at healing that the other children were getting. But Sophie, brave little Sophie who'd found her voice when it mattered most, said she wanted to stay with me and Lyra. She said we felt like family to her, like the kind of family she'd always wished she could have. Jennifer Morrison, when she finally learned the truth about what her brother-in-law had been doing to her daughter, agreed to let Sophie stay with us while she got the help she needed to process her own guilt and trauma. The trials that followed made national news, the largest child trafficking network ever uncovered in rural America, with connections to predators in major cities and international buyers who paid premium prices for American children. Most of the men involved got life sentences, though a few managed to cut deals in exchange for testimony that helped prosecute the bigger fish in the network. But for me and Lyra and Sophie, the real healing happened quietly in a little house by the ocean in California, where we'd moved after the trials were over. I used the settlement money from the civil lawsuits to buy us a place with a garden where Sophie could plant flowers and a workshop where Lyra could build the furniture she'd discovered a talent for. We became a family of survivors, 3 generations of women who'd learned that sometimes the only way to defeat monsters is to become something fiercer than they are. Lyra is 18 now, studying psychology in college, with plans to become a trauma counselor for children. She wants to help other kids the way Dr. Martinez helped her to turn her survival into purpose. Sophie's 15 and thriving, a bright, funny teenager who still has nightmares. sometimes, but also has dreams about becoming a teacher or maybe a social worker. Both my girls know they're loved, know they're safe, know that I'd kill anyone who tried to hurt them again without hesitation or regret. Sometimes, people ask me if I'm proud of what I did. If I think I made the right choices in those terrible moments when everything hung in the balance. The truth is, I don't know if pride is the right word for a mother who had to become a killer to save her child. But I'm not sorry, and I'd do it all again if I had to, because some things are worth more than your soul, and protecting innocent children is one of them. Grace Thompson visits us sometimes, along with some of the other guardians. We don't talk much about the past. We're too busy planning for the future, figuring out how to help more children, how to build better systems for protecting the vulnerable. We've learned that evil is patient and persistent, but so is love when it's armed with courage and determination. I'm 73 years old now, and my hands shake sometimes when I try to write. But my aim is still steady, and my resolve is still strong. Tell my story not because I want sympathy or understanding, but because somewhere out there maybe there's another mother who needs to know she's not alone in the darkness. Maybe there's someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most terrible thing you can do is also the most necessary, and that surviving requires a different kind of strength than people realize. If my story moved you, if it made you think about the children in your own community who might be suffering in silence, then maybe you can help. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Speak up when you see signs that something isn't right. Remember that predators count on our silence, our politeness, our unwillingness to ask difficult questions or make uncomfortable accusations. Still here, still fighting, still ready to be dangerous when children need protecting. And I want to know where my words are finding you, what city you're watching from. Because every voice that joins this fight makes us all stronger. Tell me in the comments where you are. And if you want to be part of making sure no more children have to suffer, like my Lyra did, like Sophie almost did, like so many others have, then subscribe to this channel and help me spread this message as far as it can go. Because the fight isn't over, and it won't be over until every child is safe. Every predator is behind bars, and every mother knows she has the power to protect what matters most. Some battles are worth your soul. This one is worth mine. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.